It's time to review Deep Red, so not so much that, which would be normal red, I think, but more a case of that, deep red, I guess. So Deep Red came out in 1975 and marked Dario Argento's return to giallo after a few years away. Before I go any further though, I will say that this is going to be a spoiler review, so if you've not seen the movie, please go away and watch it before you even think about listening to me ramble on about it. I personally think that this was Argento's best film that he'd done, at least up to this point. So I'm laying my cards on the table very early today, although I think I have mentioned in at least one other video that I really do like Deep Red. I think this is when he really perfected his formula for this sort of movie. I use that word because in essence this is the same film as those early Animal Trilogy films that he did. I think if you look at the storylines of all four movies, they are quite similar. You know, you've got the male protagonist who witnesses an early murder and then spends the rest of the story playing amateur detective well away from what the police are doing. You've got a killer working on his own or her own who commits one murder very early on and then seems to commit several more just to cover up the first one, and at various points they'll try and kill our leading man. And probably they have some really deep psychosis, some really dodgy backstory. That is all present in Deep Red, just as it was in the first three giallo films that Argento did. So this time we have a character called Mark who hears a woman dying in an apartment block quite close to where he just happens to be standing. This guy is a musician, just like the guy from Four Flies on Grey Velvet, another similarity. So as to why Deep Red is better than those early films, I just think that when you look at the different components that make these movies, I think Deep Red just scores more heavily in almost all departments. And the impressive thing about this is that those first three films were really good. It's not like they were poor or mediocre. I think The Bird of the Crystal Plumage and Cat o' Nine Tail in particular are absolutely excellent. And even Four Flies on Grey Velvet could probably hold its own against most giallo films from up and down the decades. If we start with that main character, Mark, played by David Hemmings, easily my favourite protagonist in all of Argento's films up to this point. He exudes cool. I mean, he is like an actor's version of Paul McCartney. If he broke out into a rendition of Yellow Submarine during this movie, it wouldn't feel out of place for me. Even when he's just walking around lighting a cigarette or talking to people, he is like super 70s cool. He's got women hanging off his every word. At the same time, he still projects an air of invulnerability. He still acts very scared at certain moments in this film when he thinks the killer might get him. You know, just to remind us at the same time that he's not a professional PI or a policeman. I also like the Gianna character. Her little fling with Mark is absolutely adorable, and it's so much better than the other romances that the main characters have had in Argento films up to this point. Four Flies on Grey Velvet, the main guy had sex with his wife's cousin. Cat o' Nine Tails, the reporter had a one-night stand. Not exactly much love or respect involved in it, I don't think. Okay, in The Bird with Crystal Plumage, the main guy was in a relationship with Susie Kendall's character, but they were already together at the start of the movie, so their interactions with each other throughout the story weren't particularly exciting. Completely different with Mark and Gianna. It's so much fun watching them have their little wars of words throughout the film, and the way that Gianna clearly fancies Mark from an early stage and he has to be won around. It doesn't detract from the main film at all. It's never overplayed. It's just really well written. And I think the image that I think of the most when I think of these two is Mark sat in Gianna's car, but her seat's broken, so his head is right down below the dashboard thing, whereas she's up tall, quite next to him. Just brilliant. And I guess you get to make your own mind up at the end as to whether she lives or dies. I like to think that she lives. So let's talk about the killer a little bit. Sometimes when you find out who the killer is in a film like this, it's a little bit underwhelming. It's kind of like, oh, right, okay, I can see how they would be the killer, but that's kind of made the film leading up to it a little bit less creepy now. Cat o' Nine Tails might be an example of that, but it's certainly not the case here. This woman, who turns out to be the killer in Deep Red, still just as creepy once you've found out who it is. In fact, she might just be more creepy now that I know who it is. And she has all these weird little kinks, like she likes to lay out all these childhood objects on this like felt cloth thing before she goes out to do a kill, or they might be objects from crime scenes that she's caused herself actually, and the camera does a little weaving movement through all these objects. It's really clever. I mean, it's not a complicated idea, but it's one of those things when I see it in a movie where I think that is like the most obvious thing to do in a film like this, and nobody's ever thought about it. How clever is that? And she also likes to play like a childhood song um, on like a little, I'm not sure what it is that she's using, but she plays it at the scene where she's about to commit another murder. So it sort of gives her potential victim a chance to hear this song and get away, but it sort of levels the playing field a little bit, rather than her just creeping up on that person and killing them without them having a chance. She's quite stocky, this woman, even though she's possibly in her 50s. Just her build, I could easily believe that she's quite physically capable against men as well. I mean, I'd probably have difficulty with her. Maybe not the standard American quarterback, but I think the way that they've cast this woman as well still makes her seem quite intimidating, even when you find out that it's a woman. I also love the way that the killer dies in this. I mean, the killer in Four Flies on Grey Velvet got a good ending as well, but as much as I liked that kill on a technical level, at the back of my mind I do think to myself, she would never drive into the back of a truck and get decapitated like that. But when it comes to the killer in Deep Red, I could absolutely believe that somebody would get their necklace or some form of jewellery stuck in an elevator like that. These sorts of accidents do happen in real life, even when there's no fight involved in the lead up to it. And I like that the fight between Mark and the killer doesn't go on too long. How many times have you seen a movie where everything's too over choreographed? They try and drag it out to be more epic than it needs to be, but here it's short, it's sharp, it just gets the job done. And the moment when the head comes off on the elevator, it's gloriously gorgeous. I mean, it's gross, but it's also gorgeous. That's the perfect combination for a kill in a horror film, to be gorgeous but also quite gross at the same time. My next positive is the soundtrack. Now, I'm going to stop short of saying that this is one of the best soundtracks ever, because there's some music in this film which doesn't quite fit for me, mainly that kind of detective movie type bam, 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 bam. It's all the way through this, and sometimes it does irritate me a little bit, especially in the scene where Mark visits the childhood home of the killer in the second half of the movie. In fact, that little segment of about 10 minutes is possibly my only negative for Deep Red, because Mark seems to go in and out of this house about 5 times, and I just feel like that scene could have been streamlined a little bit, just cut down to its more essential bare bones. It's a little bit all over the place, and the music is noticeably a little bit irritating around about that part of the movie. But there are also some great tunes in Deep Red, 2 in particular. One of them, I guess, would be the main theme of the film. It could also be called the killer's theme. It plays right at the start and all the way throughout at intervals. There's also this great tune that plays over the top of the killer's childhood memory of, well, it's not their childhood memory, it's the memory of the murder that set them off on their path. I think little ditties like this, these melancholic little tunes, work very well in horror films, and there's a great one here. So overall, I do really like the soundtrack, albeit with caveats. My next positive is the character of Carlo, who is Mark's friend in this movie. In fact, I don't know what this actor's name who plays Carlo, but this is probably the best performance in the film. I mean, I really like David Hemmings as Mark. He's so cool, but the guy who plays Carlo really puts a shift in. I've spoken a lot throughout my Argento review so far about the use of gay characters, because Argento throws a lot of them in there with mixed results. Sometimes he writes them really badly, sometimes really well. This is one of those films where he does write them really well. I say them, I think Carlo might actually be the only gay character in the film, I'm not sure, but it's an amazing performance, a very believable character. I think we're meant to presume that Carlo is feeling all this angst throughout the story because he's worried about coming out, but actually you realise in the end that he's just feeling that way because he's hiding this secret of his mum. So that's a really genius bit of writing. There are some amazing locations in this film, best of all being the sort of town square place where Carlo and Mark share some early scenes. It's really quiet, even though it feels like the middle of a town or a city. There's no traffic, there's no other pedestrians around. I get that it's probably quite late at night, but it's such an atmospheric place. And this is, of course, where Mark first hears the distant cries of one of the murderer's first victims, which gets him into the story. There's one gorgeous shot where there's like a statue right in the middle of where Mark and Carlo are talking to each other. I love that little moment. So before we get to the bag of terror, so I can give you my score for this film, I'll show you the version that I have. I've got an Arrow version of this. So we're back to Arrow after taking a break with Four Flies on Grey Velvet. The Blu-ray for that film was done by a completely different company. As you would expect with Arrow, absolutely tons of features. There is an audio commentary, though it's not one of my favourite. It's done by this guy on his own, and he's a little bit robotic in the way that he's just blurting out facts and stuff. It's still quite interesting, I suppose, though I will admit I turned it off halfway through and just watched the rest of the movie without the commentary on, even though I'd already watched the movie in a normal way like a few nights before. But I prefer commentaries that are more like the one that you get on the Bird of the Crystal Plumage Blu-ray, where it's two guys together sort of talking back and forth about their various anecdotes from watching the film. Right, let's get to that bag of terror and see about that score. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, struggling a little bit here. This always happens when we have 5 bloody axes, as we have today. Yeah, I'm giving the masterpiece 5 bloody axe score for Deep Red. I did have a little bit of a negative with the scene where Mark goes into the house several times over, where it seemed a little bit unnecessary, but I'm of the opinion that you maybe shouldn't rule yourself out from giving a film a masterpiece score just because of one thing. Deep Red wasn't a film that I immediately loved. When I first saw it, I hadn't seen that many giallo films. I did think it was really decent, but it was on the second viewing that I really fell in love with the movie and realised just how brilliant it is. For me, this is just one of the most amazing horror films. It is when Argento perfected his formula for this sort of thing. And I think it's quite fitting that after this, he went on to do something a little bit different with Suspiria. I mean, how would you follow up Deep Red? I know he did other giallo films further down the line, but Deep Red is an absolutely incredible film for me. It is a 5 out of 5, and there we go. So that is the end of my review for Deep Red. I'll be back with a review for Suspiria quite soon. Until next time, cheerio.